Welcome everyone to First Principles Podcast. Today is the episode where we're going to be discussing at length the carbon tax. Now, what is the carbon tax? It is kind of what it sounds like. It's a tax on carbon, but more specifically, it's essentially the carbon emissions that are produced by companies, whether it's the gas industry, whether it's the steel industry, whatever it is. If you are producing carbon emissions, then there should be a tax that's paid on it, or at least that's the theory. Now, why should people pay a tax on their carbon? So the rationale is that the carbon emissions have an externality, right? There's health impacts. So the more carbon emissions there are, this leads to global warming. This leads to climate change. This leads to pollution. This leads to decreased quality of life, theoretically, for your surrounding neighbors, for the people around you. That's what an externality is. So up to now, or generally, industry hasn't been paying for this externality of carbon. So hence the idea has come about that there are costs associated with the carbon production, and we need to essentially price in this externality of carbon, and that way we have a true cost for the things that we're producing, right? Because when we price certain products, we have to factor in all of the costs associated with that product. So this is a cost, arguably, that isn't currently being factored in. So with that being priced in, we have a new price for different products, whether it's gas, whether it's our plastics, whatever, whether it's our steel, whatever it is that relies on carbon. But then the question is, who pays that add-on price, and what do we do with that money? So this is where things get kind of into the nitty-gritty details, and we can kind of get into that as we progress into the podcast. But again, that's roughly the idea of what a carbon tax is, and the rationale for why we need to have a carbon tax implemented towards our industry. Any thoughts on that, Elliot?
No, I mean, that's a good summary of the carbon tax overall. I did want to jump into maybe talking about William Nordhaus. So William Nordhaus is an American economist, and he's a Sterling professor of economics at Yale University. And he's best known for his work in economic modeling and climate change. And he actually won a Nobel Memorial Prize in economic science in 2018. And he's really taken a close look at how a carbon tax could be used to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and finding a price that if you made carbon cost this much, it would change the market such that you would have a shift in how much people would want to emit. So he's looking at how markets work, what the price needs to be for it to be effective. And he's done a lot of work in this area. You definitely can't have a conversation
of the carbon tax without mentioning William Nordhaus. He's kind of the OG, the grandfather of modeling when it comes to tying in carbon emissions, tying that into the economy, and how we can use carbon tax in order to reduce carbon emissions. Continue, Elliot. What were you saying?
Yeah, so he is a big proponent of this idea of an internationally harmonized carbon tax to effectively reduce CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere globally. He points out a carbon tax must be implemented globally in his research, and there's got to be a pretty consistent price on carbon is what he across the globe for it to work effectively. And he goes in, he has his reasons that he prefers a tax over other systems like universal cap and trade, which he feels it has a higher potential it could become corrupted by and used incorrectly, basically. He's not a fan of subsidies, and carbon offsets, he doesn't like them either. He says they're difficult to calculate and verify. He also, you know, he likes taxes because, what does he say? They are a mature system. People understand them. Governments have been taxing people for ages. Everybody gets a tax. Nobody likes a tax, you know. Nobody, and he understands that. And so he actually also says we should do. He presents two options. He thinks there's a revenue neutral option, and his idea goes something like this: we should tax bads, not goods. So, if you were to implement a carbon tax, one way of doing it would be to lower sale or income tax proportionally to the carbon tax. Therefore, the net revenues to the government remain the same, but you're introducing a market force that is trying to correct for that price of carbon and its effects. The other is more of a, financial conservative type thinking, where it's like, do we want to balance the budget? And so this would be adding carbon tax above onto your other taxes, but the funds would come in and go against reducing deficits. He's not a fan of idea of like the carbon tax going across borders. Like, he believes if you raise a tax income from that tax in a country, that money stays in the country. He's a big proponent of that. And I think that in a nutshell is his perspective, which is key to understand, because his name does get thrown around a lot, and sometimes used incorrectly, I would say, when it comes to people talking about what an effective carbon tax looks like.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because we need to understand what his position is, since he is the one that kind of is the grandfather. Realistically, he's the one that started doing this work. He's the pioneer, and not just the grandfather. He's the pioneer. Yeah. Better word. But and you're totally right. There's a lot of people, a lot of politicians that will use his name, right, out of kind of just the brownie points of throwing out a Nobel laureate, because as you mentioned, he did win a Nobel Prize for the work that he's done, which means that he's been recognized in the scientific community as somebody that has merited acclaim from his peers. That's not a small thing. That's a pretty big deal. So as a result, people want to use his name for that name recognition. Oh, William Nordhaus says carbon tax is good. But that's where they essentially stop their thinking, and they don't look into the specifics of what his position is for the carbon tax. And I think hopefully we're going to try to present that to you guys, and hopefully you can get some value from this podcast just in that alone. That would be great, because again, I think his name is dishonestly being used, and I think that we need to get a good idea of how specifically he advocates for incorporating carbon tax versus maybe how it's being done in other places. And I think what you touched on is the fact that it's revenue neutral. That's a really important factor about this, and something that he talks about is, yes, let's tax the bads. So we're getting more money from taxing carbon. Okay, so we also tax people for income. Well, we're just doubling the burden on people, because at the end of the day, we all know that a carbon tax on companies is going to be passed down to the consumer. Okay, so that's one thing that we just have to get straight. And one thing that really illustrated this to me was recently when I was listening to the Elon Musk podcast that he was having with Joe Rogan, which we'll go into more detail later with a more in-depth analysis of some clips. But I think it was just so telling. It was so telling because he just casually, just off the cuff said, yeah, just carbon tax, we'll pass it to the consumer. We'll just pass it to the consumer. He just said it nonchalantly, didn't even bat an eye when he said it. And I found that just such, I don't know, just so telling and just so gross. Like this dude, which I won't get into more detail right now. But again, You have Elon Musk right there. He just said it right there. Just pass to the consumer. We all know what's going to happen. It's going to come down to me and you and the average individual. So what does that mean? That means that we have our tax on our income, and then this extra tax on carbon for the everyday individual who is now perhaps struggling to make ends meet via coronavirus. That's a whole new thing that's happening now. So we have more taxes, and that's why revenue neutrality is actually really important here. But again, we have to consider, how is Mr. William Nordhaus advocating for carbon tax, and how is it being used? And that's one perfect example of how it's not necessarily being done. You might say that, oh, it's being given back to households. Well, okay, is that neutral? I'm not so sure if that is, because that's not really the format that this money should be redistributed. Because again, we want to keep the money in the economy. We want to perhaps balance budgets. We want to decrease deficits. What's happening in countries like Canada, where they have incorporated carbon tax? I don't see them decreasing deficits whatsoever. I see them, matter of fact, increasing deficits with no regard. But that's a whole other subject for a whole other day.
Yeah, no, it totally is. But I want to also point out, because when we get into this area of revenue neutral, there becomes a problem. If pricing carbon becomes very successful, then realistically incomes will start to drop, because people will be emitting less carbon. Therefore, there will be less income. And William Nordhaus is aware of this, and he points out that there may come a point, if the carbon tax is widely successful in a revenue neutral tax system, that government may have to start to increase other taxes to maintain revenues. But that's down the line. That is
way down the line.
Way down the line. So
way down the line.
It is true, though. It will. There is a bit of concern there. Like if for it to make a measurable difference, then the outcome must be eventually governments won't get enough income from it. So that is something to consider. The other perspective that William Nordhaus had was, his because he wants to make this global, but there's a lot of places that this is not of concern, and perhaps something they just politically they can't make happen. But he really believes in being a role model. So he says this. He says, why would other countries like China or India do anything like a carbon tax if the U.S. isn't doing anything? The U.S. doesn't have to do it alone, but should be in the first wave of adopters. Yeah, that's more of a perspective of William Nordhaus, for whatever that is worth. But I just thought that was worth
personal philosophy.
Yeah.
And I kind of agree, because at the end of the day, in the West, we're kind of the ones that are exporting the culture, right? When you think about who's the predominant culture, it's kind of the West that's exporting their culture. And we think of globalization, it's like people in the East dressing like people in the West, not people in the West dressing like people in the East, right? Yeah, right. So just think about it like just practically in terms of like what's happening. So if people on the West or in Western countries, Canada, US, Europe, whatever, if they're the ones that are exporting the culture, then we are technically the leaders, and they're kind of following suit. They're the, people in the East, they're the ones that are dressing with like freaking skinny jeans and like freaking Yeezys and all that stuff. Well, you know what? Like they're starting to dress like us, and they're kind of changing it up, doing their own little thing. But yeah, I think let's call a spade a spade. So if we're the ones that are exporting the culture, then we also, if we were to take leadership in this type of situation, like carbon tax, I think it could lead to more pressure on those countries that like such as India and China to follow suit. Whether or not they will, that remains to be seen. But I believe that if there is global, international, ubiquitous pressure, then I think that they would eventually follow suit, because we have to consider that as countries become more developed, as GDP per capita grows, people gain more money. As they gain more money, they start thinking of different ways to spend it. And that's when our desire for environmentalism, for taking care of the environment, cleaning up the river, cleaning up the air, all that good stuff really comes in. Because before that, all you're thinking about is just making it. You're just trying to survive. So you have to consider that as those countries get wealthy, their interest is probably will increase towards environmentalism, and they're going to look towards the exporting of the culture. And if we're exporting the culture that, hey, we need to, adopt a carbon tax, we need to, and it's got to be global. I think there's no guarantees. There's no guarantees, but it increases the probability that they will follow suit. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. There's a lot of people would say it's jumping on bandwagons as they occur, but there's part of that. That's also a thing. But it also, I think, in my experience with government, people want to do something that is proven. There's so much risk with doing things that are uncertain, and to jump in and do something for the first time and try it out.
It's scary.
It's scary. You're going to make mistakes. And but as people start to do something new, and they make the mistakes and they fix those mistakes and they find solutions for it, that's how we innovate, and that's how we grow solutions, and people are more comfortable taking them on. So you have to be in a position where you can bear the risk associated with trying something new. And that's where it becomes very important to make sure the way you implement something new, you got to really look at what could be the side effects, what could be the collateral damage of trying something new. And so that's definitely worth considering as we move into trying new solutions like a carbon tax. And I'm going to lay out another idea, but maybe I'm going to hold off about getting too much into it. But I wanted to touch on right here. William Nordhaus is discussing carbon tax as a way to reduce atmospheric concentrations of CO2. That's his perspective, okay? Because there's a concern CO2 is going to go up. There could become a tipping point, and the change in climate, it could be catastrophic, may not, but there's a problem there. Now, there's another reason to perhaps want to pursue a carbon tax that doesn't have to really do with CO2, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But maybe first, let's jump into this interview with Elon Musk, because he's a big dog in this race. There's countries that have already adopted carbon taxes, Canada being one of them. But Elon, he lives in the States. He is the richest man in the world right now. So what he's interested in, what his beliefs are, what his concerns are going to translate into the decisions he makes at his companies. And I don't think you can underestimate how powerful that is, especially when all the endeavors that he's currently involved in. So I think it's important for us to listen to this man and what he's saying. And so what I did was, he was on JRE, what podcast, I don't know what episode it was on, recently, this year, 2021. And they get into a whole range of topics worth listening to. But I've taken some key clips and broken them down. So I wanted to start off with clip 1, which I titled "The Origin of Elon's Interest in Electric Cars."
Okay, clip 1. And actually, just before that, I do want to touch on something real quick that you mentioned, is that we don't lose sight of the goal. Ultimately, the goal is to reduce atmospheric CO2 concentrations, and carbon tax is one method to do that. There's different methodologies, and we will go into some of those methodologies as well. You touched on cap and trade. There's emissions regulations, and so on and so forth. But again, the goal is to reduce CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. So let's get into this clip of Elon Musk on JRE.
Electric cars since for a long time, since basically high school, early college.
What'd you think of that documentary? Who Killed the Electric Car?
I thought it was pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it's worth watching.
Interesting. Mortally wounded, not killed.
Exactly. Exactly.
But
I mean, the irony is like, man, can you imagine just how different a future GM would have had?
Yeah.
Because they had the EV1, electric vehicle 1. If they had just gone EV2, EV3, man, they would have just owned the world.
Who knows where we'd be right now with electric cars, too, and the technology with that kind of money behind
Yeah.
it. What's fascinating now, you're seeing like this Mustang, this sort of SUV style Mustang that's electric.
Yeah.
You know, you're seeing so many different vehicles that are electric. There's so many companies that have electric cars now. And it's really been becoming interesting. Porsche's electric car. There's a large supply of electric cars now. I mean, that's got to make you feel good, though. Because without you and without Tesla, there was no way it would be where it's at right now.
But yeah, I mean, in the early days, my interest in electric cars was mostly driven by the fact that it wasn't environmental in the sense of like CO2, parts per million in the atmosphere type of thing. I do think that has added urgency to the situation, but my original interest was just like, we're going to run out of oil, and then civilization is going to collapse, and so if we don't have some kind of sustainable energy situation, which really is electric cars, solar energy and electric cars, then civilization is going to fall apart, and we'll be back in the Stone Age or something bad, but we're not going to be able to move forward. It won't be a good future. So my interest in electric cars was like, okay, how do we make this work?
Okay, so I wanted to point out a couple different things. So I'm listening to them talk about that documentary, Who Killed the Electric Car, and that came out in 2006. So Elon was born in 1971. So he's 49 right now, and so he would have been 35 when that came out. But Joe kind of just threw that in there, asked him out of the blue. That wasn't really what drove his interest in it. He then goes on further. Well, actually, before I go on further, he makes that interesting comment, just how much different would GM's future have been if they had just continued this. And he says they would have owned the world, which is a pretty big thing to say. I mean, I think he means like they would have been massively successful now, and that's what he's realizing with his own company.
Totally. Yeah, it's almost like he's saying that he owns the world now, and they would have been in his position.
Yeah. So
I don't know.
The choice of words was interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he says his original interest in electric cars was not environmental. Not environmental in the sense of CO2 and parts per million. He's talking about parts per million in the atmosphere. Although he says he thinks that's added some urgency to the situation. We'll get into his thoughts on that a little further in later clips. He then goes on to say his interest was driven by the idea we're going to run out of oil and civilization is going to collapse. And I found this super interesting. I think this is like a hinge, actually, on dissecting some of the drives of this man, because we, in our first podcast, we looked at this concept. We looked at peak oil theory, okay? And when the first paper came out by Herbert, I think it was 1956, okay? He was born in 1970. And so he was being educated in a world where this was a real threat. It was falling the curve. Peak oil production in the U.S. was starting to fall. And now I know he was born. I don't know how many people know this, but he was born in South Africa. Okay, so he was born in South Africa. He lived there for like 16 years. I think he then moved to Canada for like 2 years. And he was 18 years old when he moved to Canada. And then he finally started and he was doing some schooling in Canada. And then he went 2 years later over to school in the U.S. And so he was 20. He was 20 years old in 1992, okay? So Herbert had this prediction, oil production was going to go up, it was going to fall off, and it was still following that prediction. It actually peaked a little higher than what Herbert predicted, but it was following the curve. So for like a good 16 years of his life, he was told this was going to happen. It concerned him, it motivated him, his interest. And then it wasn't until 2008 that that production skyrockets back up, and we go over this in our first episode. Through new technologies coming online and changing oil production. And so I just I'll touch on this a little bit later, but I was like, okay, this is interesting. Like he definitely was motivated by this concept, and he was living in the States where it was a reality. This, I think, speaks to, like I said, what drives human innovation and the advancement of technologies, and it will play a role into kind of some of his future thinking as well. I think as well.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a pretty good analysis. Like, it's interesting to point out. Yeah, like he was probably thinking about the peak oil theories from Herbert. And if you haven't checked it out, please go listen to our first podcast, Peak Oil Theory, where we go in depth on that. But I think it's interesting because he kind of talks about how like the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is kind of like a moot point. It doesn't really interest him too much. It's more so the peak oil production and how it's going to decrease. But as we kind of saw, if that's your motivating factor, I don't know, we kind of have more time than I think we had envisioned. So when he was going through his schooling, he would have thought this is like an existential crisis. But I think what we've slowly discovered due to the advent of new technologies, which has allowed us to access new previously inaccessible oil reserves, that this has led to an increase in oil production, which kind of taken away this whole existential threat nature of it. In terms of running out, there's a bit of an existential threat in terms of getting access, maybe from like your foes around the world. That might be more so of an issue. But in terms of the actual production, it seems that there's more time that's continuously being added to that timeline.
Yeah, and before we go to the next clip, that's a good point, and I want to posit my hypothesis now, perhaps. Mm-hmm. We have, somebody come up with a theory. We have a finite resource, and they're comparing it to real data. They make a prediction. Prediction has a time scale, and things seems to be following that prediction. And because somebody had that concern, verified that concern, came up with and voiced that concern, it drove innovation. And Elon, just because eventually oil shot back up and we have it now longer than we think it did, what it did is it advanced other technologies and made him who he is. Now, something similar could happen with this whole CO2 situation. But I'm going to say it is and I think he's making this point later on, the importance of not assuming everything's going to be okay. It is in the pursuit of doing something, in the potential of things going really bad if we continue this way, that will ultimately help us prevent that thing from happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's like you can't be complacent. We have to always be striving for continuous innovation and improvement, because it also puts us into the mindset and the state of mind necessary in order to continue to innovate when those problems arise. So if something does come up, you're kind of already set to rejigger your position as necessary and be agile with things, as they say. So you can shift resources, move around because you're already thinking about it. You're already in that right headspace in order to approach the problem. Like, okay, I've kind of considered this. Boom, let's go. I have plan A, plan B, plan C, whatever. Okay, so you want to maybe jump into that second clip?
Yeah, let's talk about it. So the second clip is called "The Fundamental Good of Tesla."
The fundamental good of Tesla. Any precursor, or should I just play it and we'll go into it?
Yeah, let's just play it.
The rate at which we are producing what are called lithium-ion cells, but are really primarily iron and nickel cells, it's increasing very, very rapidly year over year. It's just that in order to compensate for the rest, for an economy which is fundamentally based on fossil fuels, you need a shit ton of batteries. So a gigaton, giga shit ton of batteries. And that is what, that's going to happen. It's just a question of when. That's why I say, like, the fundamental good of Tesla is to what degree it accelerates the advent of sustainable energy. It's inevitable. Like, either we have sustainable energy, it's tautological. It's either we have sustainable energy or civilization collapses. So, if civilization doesn't collapse, we will have sustainable energy.
We're going to need a giga shit ton of batteries.
I like that.
It was a good one. So, you know, and that's going to happen. He says, you know, we're going to get there. It's just a question of when. And so what he says at the end, he says the fundamental good of Tesla is to what degree it accelerates the advancements of sustainable energy. Okay, he says either we're going to have sustainable energy or civilization is going to collapse. That's what he's thinking. Okay, and I found this. You'll see him reiterate this throughout it, but this idea that what Tesla is doing in advancing technology in this era is accelerating us towards sustainable energy. We know we can exist however many years, maybe it's 100 more years, and assuming nothing else wipes us out and we're all civil with each other, then we'll still be around on this planet, and maybe at that point we won't have fossil fuels. But the last thing we want to do is be left in a spot where we're pouring the last drop out and we still haven't thought about how we're going to make this work without this stuff. So I think that's how he's measuring in his head his work. Is that fair, you think? Yeah,
it's kind of like his why.
Yeah,
it's, you know, whenever you have like a successful company, generally you want to look at the why behind the company, and whether it's Apple, Nike, Tesla, whatever. Elon Musk has his why figured out, and that is the degree to which he can sustain sustainable energy within society. And I honestly, I don't think that's a really controversial statement, because like, you need energy in order to function, so you better have that figured out. It's just a question of how do we get to sustainability, what is sustainable. And I don't think it's a controversial statement whatsoever, though.
I agree. No, I don't think it's controversial.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's less political, and we can get into that than other narratives. But maybe let's jump into this next clip, which
let's do it.
Is called "We Will Be Fine." ...
Occurring because of the increased parts per million of CO2 in the oceans and atmosphere. It has some acidification it makes the water just a little bit more acidic, and it just causes the air to be a little warmer, not a lot. I think sometimes people look at the temperature, especially in Celsius. You might say, like, okay, it's like 20 degrees Celsius. I mean, can a small ppm increase in carbon really move the needle that much? But actually, you should be looking at it in degrees Kelvin. So then it's like, actually, it's like more like we're at around 300 Kelvin. And so, what would it take to have like only a 0.3% increase would be 1 degree Celsius, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So therefore, this is actually, it's a smaller percentage increase than you'd think when looking at temperature in the absolute as opposed to, above the freezing point of water. So, and then if people weren't just living right on the water, then that would also help a lot. But it's just like we love living right on the water. So like the humanity is like a thermometer. It's like, you look at like a thermometer, like a, like old school sort of analog thermometer, which is like, changing the temperature as a function of like some liquid that is increasing its volume due to temperature. And it only takes a little bit of a small increase in volume to raise the temperature more, on an old school analog liquid thermometer. And humanity's like that. We've just decided that we want to live right on the damn beach.
Yep.
So, because the beach is cool. Now, the problem is you're right. You're like, it's kind of like if we wanted to say, what's the most sensitive instrument you could, like, how can we maximize our sensitivity to water level? Well, live right on the ocean. Well, okay, we just did that.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, well, and by the way, like throughout history, like the water level has varied a lot. Like it's like nutty how much it's varied. So, and then if you look at, say, the CO2 parts per million, based on the fossil record, I mean, it just looks like a wall. I'm not like a doomsayer here. I'm like, my view is that if, provided we are not complacent about a sustainable energy economy, I think things will be fine. If we are complacent about it, that's where problems arise. So, like, to be totally frank, I think we'll be fine. But as long as we don't behave as though we're going to be fine, we will be fine.
Wow.
So I clipped this one because I think in part I was listening so closely to his train of thought and him trying to maneuver this area of talking about CO2 and its impact overall to global warming. And I've tried to navigate that area to myself, and it's a hard one to cover in a podcast setting, sitting down and discussing it. But I do want to dive into some of what he said there in a closer detail. One of the most confusing bits is at the beginning with him talking about Kelvin and temperature, and I'm going to try to break it down, although as you'll see, the conclusion here is a little different than what you expect. So he says, first he starts by saying CO2 causes the air to be a little bit warmer, not a lot, okay? It's a little bit. And he goes on to say, I think people look at temperature, especially in Celsius, and then he goes, it like trails off, and he's like, can be a small ppm increase. By ppm, he means part per million increase, and he's talking about concentration of CO2, just if that wasn't clear. Increased, can a small ppm increase in carbon really move the needle that much? But actually, you should be looking at it in degrees Kelvin. And as soon as I heard him say that, I was like, I don't follow, because if you look at the formula for Kelvin is equal to whatever your degrees are in Celsius plus 273.15. It's if you go up 1 degree in Celsius, you go up 1 degree in Kelvin. So then I was like, well, maybe he misspoke, and he was saying, he's talking about Fahrenheit, because Fahrenheit has, that formula where it's your temperature in Fahrenheit. So to get from Fahrenheit to Kelvin, it's, Fahrenheit temperature minus 32 times a fraction, 5/9, plus your 273 constant. So what this means is, if you have 20 degrees Celsius, this is equal to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? And so if you go from 68 degrees Fahrenheit to 69 degrees Fahrenheit, so that's 1 degree increase in Fahrenheit, that's not going to take you from 20 degrees Celsius to 21 degrees Celsius. No, it's going to take you from 20 degrees Celsius to 20.555. because of that fraction there. You're only going up 0.5 of a degree in the Celsius scale. And that's going to be the same thing for the Kelvin. If you're converting from Fahrenheit to Kelvin, and you go up by a degree in Fahrenheit, the degrees in Kelvin is going to just go up by that 0.55K. So then I'll continue with what he said, because now we got that out of the way. We are around 300 degrees Kelvin. Sure. We already talked about it. So 20 degrees is, what is 20 degrees? 20 degrees is
like standard temperature and pressure.
Right. So it's around 293 degrees Kelvin. So he's just rounded it up. And he said, if we, what would it take to have a 0.3%, so that's 0.003 increase. Okay, so that if you took 0.003 times it by your 300 degree Kelvin, he's just talking about what happens to get it go up to 1 degree Kelvin. It's going to take 1 degree increase in Fahrenheit, and then he goes on to say it's going to be a 0.5 increase, or no, a 2 degree increase in Fahrenheit. And this is all just temperature conversions. But then he ends the sentence by saying, therefore, it's a smaller percentage increase than you would think when you're looking at temperature in the absolute, as opposed to above the freezing point of water. And he just kind of trails off, and I'm like, what was the point you're trying to make there? Like, I'm sure Joe was lost, I was lost, like he started doing some conversions here, but I'm thinking, I know you deal with Kelvin more probably because of space, and Kelvin is used because of the range of temperatures between like what's useful for Earth and outer space. That makes sense to me, but I'm like, I don't know. Anybody listening to that probably was like, okay, what are you saying there? And then he goes on.
Sorry, just to interject there. Like, I think what he was essentially saying is that he's saying it's not as big of a deal as we think it is. So he's saying that because the relative change, if you were to look at from degrees Celsius to Kelvin, is going to be a smaller relative change. So even though we think it's going to change by, say, X percentage, that X percentage is actually a lower percentage when we look at it in absolute terms. So he's kind of trying to say that it's actually not as bad as we think it is, due to the fact that if you were to, change your basis, that's what it really comes down to. What's your basis of your assessment? So if you change your basis, your baseline, then that's going to change that relative. It's kind of playing with numbers, like you said. So he's saying that it's not as big of a deal as we might think it is. That's what it really comes down to.
What's not as big of a deal?
That the temperature change, the in terms of the temperature change that is going to happen as a result of changing CO2 concentrations.
Right.
If you were to look at that in terms of Kelvin as opposed to Celsius, it's even less, I guess.
Right. But my whole point there is that Kelvin and Celsius, they change equally or proportionally with every increment of degree in them. They're just different numbers. So but the number is right. So the number changes, but what's your baseline? Your baseline is 290, right? So like for you to go from 290, what's 2%? 2% of 290 is different than 2% of 20. Oh, I see. Right.
So if your baseline is 293 versus your baseline is 20, then a 2% change or whatever the percent changes, that's going to be different, right? If you have 2% change in temperature Celsius, then that's not going to be the same in terms of the percentage or in terms of the absolute value. Like you can have 2% changes one, 2% change the other, but it's going to be a different number in terms of the actual degrees changed. It's because you're going from 2% of 273 versus 2% of 20 or whatever.
I just find it so funny that he thinks that's what people are getting confused, and this was going to help them make more sense of it. I was like, he's obviously thinking in a different way on that one for sure.
So essentially, he's saying like it's going to be a smaller relative change. So kind of calm your panties, keep your panties in a bunch, or whatever the term is. Calm your horses, simmer down.
Yeah.
And so it kind of, I don't know, it kind of sounds like he's just kind of more lackadaisy, but then he's just kind of throwing in but as long as we're not complacent about it, just so that people realize that he's not trying to take global warming and climate change lightly. He's serious about it via that last statement that he's gonna that we can't be complacent. So he's kind of like his way out. Yeah. He's kind of playing with that line. He's kind of saying, don't worry about climate change, but as long as we like still kind of move towards that direction, kind of like as long as we're making progress type of thing.
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot more to say about that, but I'll continue through this clip and what he says. So then he goes on and he says, he talks about the whole thing, people living, right by water and the impact that has to our sensitivity to changes in our environment. It's like if you are closer to something that might change, it's just you're going to be affected by it more likely. And that's been a realization of mine for, a while. And it's just that is one of those odd, just realities of societies and people. There are so many advantages being close to water, but there's disadvantages, and
it is cool.
It's cool.
Like you said.
It's
cool.
Great for transportation. It's great for sanitation purposes. There's all these for irrigation purposes.
It's functional too. It's not just cool. There's a lot of function. It's not like it just happened out of nowhere. Elon, sorry.
Yeah.
Like, for some reason, these humans just decide to live next to water. Like, why? Well, maybe it's practical. Maybe that's one of the reasons that the U.S. became what it was, because of the river and the water course connections that allowed port cities close to the ocean to transport goods and materials inwards into the U.S. and vice versa. You mother, he's got, I don't know, man. Yeah. The more I hear this dude, like I like him, but I'll tell you straight up, yo. I used to be a super big Elon fan, but I don't know. The more I hear, it's just you kind of get his like nonchalant ego attitude type of thing, which we all have, whatever. I'm not gonna hate, but that's another example, right? The whole, it's like, we're fine, like just as long as you don't live next to the beach type of thing, right? Again, he's kind of like he's kind of trying to tell people we're gonna be okay, like don't worry, like it's just people are close to the beach, like these silly folks, we just want to do it because it's cool. Like, no, Elon, there's a bit more to it than just it's cool. You like, again, like it just kind of shows his like just being so passive, careless, like, and obviously he's not careless because he's given this a tremendous amount of thought, but it shows maybe a lack of relatability, because again, I go back to my previous statement where he can just nonchalantly say, oh, let's pass off the carbon tax down to the consumer, we don't got to worry about it. Oh, that's great for you to say, Mr. Tesla owner, or the creator of Tesla, who can then benefit off of the federal tax incentives for companies such as yours. So yeah, you don't mind paying the carbon tax because you're on the other end getting paid by the government, you fuck. Like straight up, man. Look, that's one of the things in the episode. Like I'm gonna like straight up like.
And we're gonna get there. He's gonna. I think the next clip. Yeah,
you got that one, because I wanted to go off on that shit. Like this guy.
That's next clip.
Okay, that's next baby.
But yeah,
right.
no.
Okay, I'll save my rant for later. Trust, man. I don't want to sound like an Elon hater or an Elon butt kisser, because there's things that he does that I like. There's things that he does that I don't like. People are complex. It is what it is, you know.
It is, and I agree with a lot of that. And what I would say is when he's on a podcast and he decides to, interestingly, he structures his arguments in such a way that he opens himself up for a lot of things. Like you're not really sure, where. Obviously, he's a smart guy, and obviously he's got it doing a lot, because there's a lot of difference between the different companies he's overseeing and involved with, right? So you got to imagine he stretched thin a little bit. But there's times like these when in these interviews where he puts together these arguments, and it just doesn't help him or convincingly portray an argument to somebody who might be a little more skeptical of him, of what might otherwise be an advantage if you pursue what he is preaching or wants, and that is a problem. And they talk about him he talks about himself being an introverted kid. Maybe this is just a personality thing, and he's just not very good at interviews. But and it's Joe Rogan. It's very casual. They're drinking whiskey. Mm-hmm. It is what it is. But I agree. Like certain things, like he'll say something, and like that is just, it doesn't encapsulate everything, and it almost comes off silly or
I think that's the beauty of a podcast, though. You kind of or I don't know, like you say a bunch of stuff, and I guess it kind of just shows your way of thinking to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. And these are thoughts that he probably believes, and not to say that they're wrong or anything, but kind of shows maybe a bit of nonchalantness towards the problem. Again, kind of brushing off, oh, we live next to beaches because they're cool. Yeah, that's part of the issue. There's more to it than that. Also saying, yeah, I don't mind SpaceX, Tesla, whatever, paying carbon tax, whatever, we should pay it too. Well, great, but you're also on the opposite end of receiving a whole bunch of subsidies, so you can kind of pay some tax here, get the subsidies on the other end. So it just, yeah, but that's just business as it is. It is what it is. I'm not gonna hate. He's doing his thing. He's running his companies. But you know what? When you talk, like you're gonna talk, we're gonna check you, bro. We're gonna.
That's right. Yeah.
Gonna call Fresh Principles Podcast. Gonna check you, bro. Whether you so maybe if you ever hear this, Elon, check yourself, son.
You're gonna dissect your clips here, for sure. So okay, let's jump into that carbon tax one, because let's get into this.
Clip 4.
Yes.
Honestly, would be just to have a carbon tax. Like the economy works great. Like prices and money are just information. Prices are information. If the price is wrong, the economy doesn't do the right thing. So we got basically an unpriced externality in the carbon concentration in the oceans and atmosphere. Like it's kind of like not paying, like if you're not paying for garbage removal or something. Like, okay, everyone's going to throw garbage in the street. It's right. Like garbage removal is free. But it's like there's a little bit of like, okay, garbage removal isn't free. You've got to pay a little bit for this. And because we're not paying for the CO2 capacity of the oceans and atmosphere, we have what in economics is called an unpriced externality. So the market is unable to respond to an unpriced externality. If we just put a price on it, the market will react in a sensible way. But because we don't have a price on it, it's behaving badly.
So theoretically, how would you put a price on that? Like, would you look at various industries and how they contribute to the CO2?
Yeah, I mean, just put it at the point of consumption.
And tax it.
It ends up being, electricity and gasoline, pretty much. Now, you could make this a non-regressive tax. You could say, like, okay, well, what if somebody's like driving around a lot and they're low income? It's like, hey, great, give them a rebate. So it's like, hey, give a tax rebate. That's the way to do it.
And then the market would be forced to respond to the fact that
the market just does things automatically based on pricing. Mm-hmm. So markets work great if the pricing is correct. It's only when something, you have a tragedy of the commons and the price is not there that the market does not respond, nor would you expect it to. So if you have like the public toilets problem where it's like nobody's responsible for it, nobody's paying for it, it's like, okay, well, public toilets are not good. So as soon as you put a price on it, the right thing will happen automatically. So,
is there been a response to this? Like, is this something?
I talked to the Biden administration, incoming administration, and they were like, well, this seems too politically difficult. And I was like, well, but this is obviously a thing that should happen. And by the way, SpaceX would be paying a carbon tax too. Sure. So I'm like, I think we should pay it too. It's not like we shouldn't have carbon generating things. It just should be a price on this stuff.
And that would encourage people to make either carbon neutral.
Automatically fix the problem. For sure. You know, I was thinking about like taxes. It's like, you know, here we are drinking alcohol. Now, taxes on alcohol and tobacco are higher than on, let's say, fruit and vegetables. Okay? Because everyone knows, like, fruit and vegetables are good for you, and alcohol and tobacco are not good for you.
Vice.
Yeah. So we're like, yeah, you should probably bias the taxes towards alcohol and tobacco, have higher taxes on alcohol and tobacco, and lower taxes on fruits and vegetables. Yeah, it's just sensible. Like, same thing goes for energy.
All right. Yeah, that's the end of the clip there. So, you know, it starts off, it says Elon's top recommendation is a carbon tax. To summarize it in 4 points, he says, you know, we have an unpriced externality. We talked about that terminology, that language that probably came mostly from William Nordhaus. We need to put a price on carbon. He says, put the tax at the point of consumption. This is very, you know, we've talked about this a bit, and I think this is similar to what we do in Canada. Not to go down that road, there's more to that. But he then goes on to say, you know, primarily electricity and gasoline. And then he's like, this doesn't need to be an aggressive tax, you know, kind of the nonchalant one about, you know, if you're low income and you're driving around a lot or have to drive around a lot, you give them a tax rebate. He then goes on to say, which was interesting, that the Biden administration thinks it's too politically difficult. And I think he actually says later in the podcast that he's like, I think that's like he says, I think he said to them, he's like, I think that's why 50% of the people voted for you or something like that. And I was like, really? Okay. Interesting. But I didn't clip that.
I think that was actually kind of telling again to maybe part of his disconnect. I think that was really a telling moment. Again, very small, but yeah, he was like, yeah, that's like more than half the reason why you guys got voted in. Nah, man. More than half the reason why he got voted in wasn't for their climate strategy.
Yeah.
Wasn't for Biden. Like,
come on.
You, like, dude. Like, but again, he's a busy dude. He's got a bunch on his plate, so maybe we can give him a pass. But again, like, I go back to my point. He's disconnected from the average individual. He's not, which happens when you're freaking richest dude in the planet. Like, I get it, dude, but like, let's just call a spade a spade. Let's just call a spade a spade. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah, it was an interesting kind of throwaway thing, and he also him just like, you know, it will correct itself, like it is a solution. It's too bad. I mean, they cover so much, but that is like the extent of the carbon tax discussion. For it being his top recommendation, it was very like, okay, he gave some you know, examples
nonchalant
of the whole tobacco, and you know, it's a sensible thing to do. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, you need to really talk about that whole non-aggressive tax part of it, because that has got to be one of the biggest concerns for most people when they hear taxes. And they think, oh, someone's talking taxes, it means I'm going to have to pay more money. And, you know, when you know that is a top concern of people, you need to clearly indicate how you're going to, you know, implement a tax that is not going to make life worse for people. That's what it comes down to. How are you going to implement a tax, which everybody goes, oh, not a tax, don't want that, that's going to mean cost me more money. How are you going to assure people that is not going to be the case? And it's just kind of brushed over so quickly here, but that has got to be one of the primary concerns, like I said, for most people hearing somebody discuss a new type of tax, especially for those people that are on the fence about the actual impact CO2 emissions have on the atmosphere. So they hear, first off, they have the idea that it's not a problem, or it's an insignificant problem, CO2. And furthermore, they're hearing someone asking for a tax. And we're going to get more into the politics of why you got to be careful about being clear about what you mean by things. Because a lot of people are going to be like, nah, that's not good. And to your point, it's also very convenient that you are in the industry that will directly benefit, if for the most part, like SpaceX, sure. I don't even know. I was trying to figure this out, how much hydrocarbons actually play a role in jet fuel propulsion. Like there's types of fuel that don't actually rely on hydrocarbons, like they're made other ways, that I know satellites are using. But that's another thing. And my whole thing is like, okay, you say that, but like, is it really going to be that big of a hit to you to have to pay that tax for SpaceX, because there's all the other things you're doing that obviously are going to benefit from an increase in sustainable energy. And it's that's not even the issue though, because I want more sustainable technologies to come online, but I just think, these are the criticisms people are going to have of Elon when he says stuff like this.
Mm-hmm. And I think you really touched on some interesting points right there, is because he's saying first and foremost that, hey, the CO2 issue isn't that big of a deal with his whole spiel about Kelvin and degrees Celsius and how, it's a smaller relative change. So you just kind of said how it's really not that big of you were just downplayed the whole situation. And then now you're going to make the case for carbon tax. I don't know, man. It just kind of seems a bit backwards. You just made a bunch of statements which essentially undercut your whole argument that we need carbon tax, because you just said that, it's not that big of a deal, we don't need to worry about it. But I guess, yeah, you said as long as we act on it to a certain degree, and maybe this is your proposition. I don't think so, because I think you're talking more about technological solutions. I don't think that you would propose that any type of these types of solutions would come from government. It's more technological innovation. Obviously, as an entrepreneur, you're looking for technological innovation to solve these problems. And I think when it comes to his point about we will pay, he sounds so noble, right?
Yeah.
Like, bro, dude, this really grinds my gears right here. He sounds so noble. We'll pay it as well at SpaceX. Don't worry, we're good too. We'll pay. So let's think about who is the primary customer of SpaceX. NASA. Okay. And how does NASA get their money? Government funding. Where does government funding come from? Taxes.
You just closed the loop.
So you see how Elon Musk can be such a great guy. He can say, no worries, we'll pay the carbon tax too. We'll just flip the bill to our customer, which just so happens to be you. Like, I don't know, man. This is type of stuff that I hear from him. This is just like, it just really makes me uncomfortable, man. It really makes me uneasy. Like, I like you, dude, but like these types of statements really make me cringe sometimes, man. Like, you gotta freaking I don't think that he's realizing what he's saying here.
No.
We'll flip you sound so noble there, don't you, buddy? Anyways, I'm not gonna go on that point.
Yeah, let's move into the next clip, because we're going to hear more of him, and we're getting to the end of our Elon discussion, and we'll move into something else. But just to set this up, this one I titled, if CO2 ppm keep going up, shit might hit the fan. And let's hear why I titled that clip this.
Carbon tax seems like the most reasonable thing that anyone could ever ask of an industry that is, without a doubt, causing some problems. I mean, there's no one's saying it doesn't cause problems. People would deny the extent of the problem, but no one says that excess CO2 from emissions is not an issue.
No, I mean, like Exxon's own scientists said in I think it was the late 70s, we think there might be a problem here with climate change due to the CO2. It's like internal, their own documents, their own people. Then they were like, be quiet.
Isn't it weird when environmental things become political, though? When the denial of the environmental thing is predominantly from some factions of the right, and then the opposite is from some factions, and then it becomes a political thing. So they dig their heels in the sand, and they're like, no, This is fine. This is the way the Earth is. There's a cycle, a natural cycle, and it just becomes this like mantra that they repeat.
It's true there is a natural cycle, but that does not explain the situation.
Right. The wall, as you described.
It's a wall, man.
Yeah.
I mean, you just look at carbon parts per million, and it just looks like a wall. Like it just goes like blah blah blah. 200 to 300 parts per million. Bam, 400. Out of nowhere.
There's also some weird arguments that some people will make in terms of the impact that it has on plant life, and that it actually is making the Earth greener.
Oh, I think that's actually true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's not necessarily okay. It still causes problems.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to be like as precise. Or at least the least amount wrong that I can be. I'm trying to be the least amount wrong.
Because plants live off carbon dioxide, so
more CO2 it does improve plant growth. It's true.
Yeah.
Like I said, I don't think, based on where we are, provided we're not complacent, provided we don't take things for granted, I think we'll be fine. But if we're complacent and we take things for granted and we just proceed like everything's fine, and we continue on the momentum of CO2 emissions, we're taking a big risk. And the especially big risk is if there's a nonlinear event. Okay, so the CO2 ppm, parts per million, has been increasing, pretty reliably, 2 or 3 ppm per year. But you could have a nonlinear event.
What would constitute a nonlinear event?
If we melt the Siberian tundra, there's like a massive amount of trapped gas and dead plant matter that's frozen solid. Now, if that warms up and that decays, and that could put a massive amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, potentially. And then you have to how we what are the carbon sinks? And if you saturate the carbon sinks and you have a sudden release of CO2 from something that was previously frozen solid, that's where you could have a nonlinearity and things could go haywire pretty fast.
What could happen then?
I mean, Earth would heat up, the water level would rise. You'd have a higher probability of extreme weather events. Shit would hit the fan.
Shit would hit the fan.
Shit would hit the fan.
Shit would hit the fan. Okay, so I put that in there because, again, you just hear in the conversation when Elon says, I'm trying to just be at least the least wrong I can be, because these are treacherous waters to navigate because of the way it's become political, which is what Joe's point is at the very beginning. Because there's this battle between the natural cycles and the CO2 alarmists, and Elon says there are natural cycles, and when he keeps talking about CO2 ppms hitting a wall, what he's talking about, if anybody's wondering, is a graph you can find on NASA's website and other literature too. Basically, it's a graph showing CO2 concentrations, parts per million, dating back 800,000 years, and for the most part of it, it's talking about this is our proxy indirect measurements from ice cores, and he's talking about the fossil records, but I'm assuming he's talking about these ice core ones, and you see for thousands of years CO2 concentrations going up and down. These are the natural cycles, or part of. In this context, these are the natural cycles I think they're talking about, and concentrations are going from as low as something around 170 parts per million up to 260, 300 parts per million, and then we start to move into this modern era from the 1950s, where in 1950 it was at 300 parts per billion, and then over the last 71 years now, it's now gone up from 300 to just under 420 parts per million. So it's deviated from this historical trend. Now, there's lots of arguments about the validity of this historical stuff, but I think what's undeniable is in this modern era where we have good, accurate measurements, I'm talking about like the last 10, 15 years, that there is an increase in ppm, like just simply between what it's 2006 and 2001, with corrections to the seasonal cycles, and assuming that's all done above board, those corrections, and I believe they are, then we're talking about parts per million net increases going from 38 parts per million up to somewhere over just over 410, so as approaching 420 parts per million. So I want to focus in like that point, that in this current time period where we have accurate instrumentation, and we're actually taking direct measurements of CO2, and we're seeing this increase. That is all I wanted to clarify when he talks about it hitting the wall there. There was a few other things I wanted to say on this topic.
Yeah, I think it's an important thing to understand when he's referring to like the wall. I think it's also referred to as the hockey stick. I've heard it referred to as such, where it just looks like the tip of a hockey stick. If you can imagine the blade just kind of shooting up at a 45 almost degree angle, if not actually probably even more so, not 45, like almost 90 degree angle. So, which refers to the sharp and sudden rise in CO2, and yeah, some of the critics of that might also point to, what's your time scale that you're looking at. If you expand the time scale, you look at even bigger time scales, then CO2 was even higher at previous times. But again, it's just a question of how much is anthropogenic, which is man-made, man-generated, and how much is contributed via natural cycles. So we can kind of agree both are taking place simultaneously, but it's just a question of which one is the predominant factor. And I think that's kind of where people start to have disagreements. Which one is it?
Well, and I would like to point out that was a correct interpretation of my own understanding as well. But this modern graph that's being put around, it's very clear that we've deviated way beyond any maximum that allegedly happened in the past. So
Any maximum
ever, going back 800,000 years ago.
No, I'm talking about like in the millions. I'm talking in the millions of years. Yeah. There's other graphs as well that like in terms of calculating the concentrations of. So right now, Elliot is showing me a graph that goes back 800,000 years. That's great.
800,000, yeah.
So there's graphs. So as we know, the planet is much older than 800,000 years. And we have data that goes back, or at least we have estimations that go back as to what the CO2 concentrations were in previous eras. What I'm saying is that certain people will make the argument that if you go back even further, I'm talking about millions, tens of millions of years, talk about dinosaur times, even before dinosaur times, you do see CO2 as being significantly higher than it is now. I'm just going to put that out there. But that doesn't mean, again, that it doesn't, to me, that can, like, two things can be true at once. So that can be true. Okay, we can have a time period, say 60 million years ago, 100 million years ago, where CO2 concentrations were higher, much more higher, significantly higher than they are now. However, it can also be true that with our current contribution of CO2 into the atmosphere, we are nonetheless leading to a shift in terms of the current equilibrium, right? We have to think about chemistry and how there's an equilibrium that takes place whenever we have atmospheric gases, whenever we have any type of chemical reactions. Equilibrium is always at play. So even though we had high CO2 before, then there was an equilibrium for the plant life, for how that was being transferred and brought into oxygen via photosynthesis, right? There was an equilibrium at play. So what will happen is there's a shift in equilibrium, and that shift in equilibrium brings about a transience. Now, we can have a situation where when we're moving in that transient shift where things get a little wobbly, which could mean, certain areas get flooded, certain areas get more water than we had before. We have change in temperatures. So, like, we can have two truths, is essentially what I'm saying, is that, yes, CO2 was higher before, but that doesn't change the fact that us contributing to CO2 now in this current day and age is still, like, not having an impact, because it's going to lead to a change in the equilibrium. And with change in equilibrium, with change in general, there's always a shakiness, there's always economic costs, there's always costs associated with to change.
Yes, the unstable nature of it makes it risky, and it will follow that an equilibrium will occur again. That's just the nature of it.
Exactly.
But in that transition period is where a lot of turmoil could exist.
Equilibrium isn't reached right away. It takes time to reach equilibrium. So there's going to be a time period until we get to that point. Sorry, go ahead.
No, very good point. Very good point. Just jump in because I want to get to the end, and he does talk about. We're very close to the end of my clips here, but before we get there, he does make a point that we've made on this podcast, which is we gotta stop demonizing oil and gas. Which let's just play the clip and we can talk about it.
Okay, perfect.
I'm actually not in favor of like demonizing the oil and gas industry, because like we can't like stop instantaneously and not have oil and gas.
Right.
Like we'll like die of starvation basically.
Right.
So
that's always the argument against it, right? We need fossil fuels, and this is sort of the short-sighted argument.
We're going to need to burn fossil fuels for a long time. The question is just at what rate do we move to a sustainable energy future? So I think we should probably move there faster than slower, but it's, but I mean, the current approach is basically just to demonize oil and gas. And I'm like, okay, well, obviously, there are people who spent their whole career in oil and gas, and they started out in their career when it didn't seem like that bad of a thing to do.
Right.
So then they're like, hey man, I just spent my whole career working hard to do useful things, and now you're telling me I'm the devil. I mean, that's like gonna make them pretty upset, So I say, like, instead of demonizing oil and gas, which also they should stop lobbying against the carbon tax, by the way, then just like, honestly, the smartest thing the oil and gas industry could do would say, let's do a carbon tax. And then we'll just do a carbon tax and make us not the devil.
Make us not the devil, and they'll still make a fuckload of money.
So it'll be fine. It'll be fine. Yeah.
That seems so reasonable. I can't imagine how anybody would argue against that.
That's what I thought. I don't know. I think the Biden administration should take a strong stance on this situation.
Yeah. So, when we talk about the political nature of this and the factions on the left and the right, there seems to be more on the left an idea that just people that run the oil and gas business are just bad, evil people. And maybe that's a simplification, but it often feels that way. And it doesn't matter if it is a simplification, because people feel that way. They're going to feel attacked. And like you said, like, these are just people. They were trying to do good things. And the reality is we still need oil and gas. And, even if we develop our sustainable grid, we're going to be able to put fossil fuels to more useful applications where we haven't developed the technologies quite yet to do the equivalent thing that oil and gas is doing. And that in turn is going to extend the lengths of time we can continue to do those things. And so it's this whole very silly pointing fingers, calling people the devil. It creates division, and not good. This gotta stop. We just gotta stop.
Yeah, it's silly. It's a very childish way to look at things, and it's like you said, somebody might spend their whole life just in the oil industry, just trying to make a living, be an oil engineer, whatever. They just thought it could be a good way to make some money, and they weren't thinking about all the negative moralities associated with it that people are trying to throw onto them now. It's all this revisionist history that's taking place. Like, oh, you should have known better. Well, you know what? So should you have when you made your 20,000 mistakes that you did in your life. But that's life.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're not willing to compare people to the same level of standards you put on yourself, like, we run into problems.
I think like just like hearing Joe Rogan though just say, "Oh, that just seems so reasonable." I can't think of any.
Though, right?
I can't think of anybody that would go against that. Like, really, like, dude. It just sounded so cringy. Like, man, maybe you should do some homework before you start talking about these things. Like, I know you do your homework when you have your alien dudes on. I know you do your research when you have your alien guests. You want to talk about some aliens. You do, you know a lot about that stuff. But then you want to talk about carbon tax. Like, oh, I'm just whatever, just nonchalant. And then you make some statements like, oh, I can't think of any rational position against what you're saying. Well, yeah, no shit, man. You haven't thought about this stuff like whatsoever. And, like, Elon Musk can just make statements like, oh yeah, like, just oil and gas, stop lobbying against carbon tax, just accept it. It's the smartest thing you can do. Like, really, is it Elon Musk, the dude that, again, as we discussed, can make money off the government subsidies that you are receiving from your companies, and then claim that you're paying those same taxes, but meanwhile you're getting paid on the other end? Like, come on, man. Like, that shit is a bit
dishonest.
It's dishonest. It's dishonest as hell. And then I want to actually go back to one of the previous clips because he touched on something that was really important. And again, it just shows to me maybe a level of dishonesty maybe he hasn't even thought of, but he made the claim that markets work great when prices are correct. Right? This is what he said, right?
Yep.
Because this automatically fixes things. So when we don't have the carbon priced into the price of a good, then this is an incorrect price, which is bad. So the premise is we have more information. The correct information leads to correct price, which the market then responds to. Correct. I totally agree with what he's saying. So the thing, though, that makes this kind of greasy is that when you have a company such as Tesla, or whatever solar company, whatever it is, or SpaceX, whoever it is, that's receiving government subsidies for their work, then that is in fact impacting the price of that good in a way that is not realistic.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you want to talk about the markets would work great when prices are correct. Well, with that government influence, with those subsidies, you've actually shifted the price of the good in a direction that is incorrect, because you have you could debate whether it is incorrect because it's just additional price or additional information, but is it relevant information that should be thrown into the pricing of that good? Arguably no. Arguably no. So when you have companies and you have, just taking it back in terms of economic theory, you want to have an accurate reflection of the price of something. So this is where he's correct. But you also don't want that price to be artificially shifted. That's the correct term here, is being artificially shifted by government subsidies, by government payments, by government quote unquote investments. But that's actually shifting away from the market, and it's actually manipulating the price of that thing towards a point where it's not correct. It's incorrect. I don't know if that's clear.
It makes sense. Yeah. And it is one of those. It definitely seems like a bit of a blind spot, because you say one thing, like when we're talking about trying to reflect actual cost, and how that benefits, the correct use of something if it's in a market where if it's correctly priced, and not to mention the whole subsidy thing and how they can work in the other way, and then that question becomes like, is this even going to work out when we're talking about trying to the question was, is renewables, and let's be very narrow, and talk just about solar, is it realistic to think this technology is cost competitive and as reliable if it's going to come in? And when you have subsidies, it kind of gets weird about the cost comparison.
What is true price?
What is the true price it is? Yeah.
When you have something whose price is being adjusted for by government subsidies, whereas you have another thing whose price is not being adjusted for by government subsidies. So it's just a question again of consistency, right? Okay, he's being inconsistent again, which is what it comes down to, because he's really for having correct information when it comes to carbon tax, but he's not for having correct information for pricing when it comes to the government subsidies that he's receiving, because both of those things affect the price of your good, but he's only against one of those things. So again, it just shows an inconsistency in that approach and kind of shows a bit of a hypocrisy.
Yeah. Let's finish off this interview though with the last clip called "The Most Foolish Experiment."
Let's do this.
I'm not saying for sure shit would hit the fan, but I'm saying like the probability increases with time. So you can't just change the chemical makeup of the atmosphere and oceans and expect nothing's going to happen. This is just a chemical reaction, man. It's like, yeah. So
is there anything?
It's like, why are we even running this experiment? Like,
right.
So the crazy thing is like, hey, we know we need to have a sustainable energy economy long term because we're going to run out of oil. So then we're running this crazy experiment to see what is the effect of taking billions of tons of carbon that was deep underground, putting it in the atmosphere and the oceans, and what's going to happen as a result of that. And it's it's like literally the craziest experiment in human history, because we know no matter what that we have to have a sustainable energy future. We have to, because otherwise civilization will collapse. So what the hell are we running this experiment for?
Because we're accustomed to doing things a certain way.
This is going to go down as the most foolish experiment in the history of human civilization.
The most foolish experiment in human history. Let's take it right back to the beginning, and my point about trying to dive into some of the reasons Elon got into electric cars and the whole Herbert curve and prediction, and I think I just want to finish it off. I know I said it before. It's this types of mindsets about catastrophe that drive people to innovate, and it's clear to me that this is his rational type of thinking on this. It's like he sees it as the solution is we got to transfer to a sustainable form of power generation, and if we don't do that, then it's the end of civilization. That's the stakes he's looking at it at. And I think there's positive things that can come out of people pursuing it that way to some degrees when it comes to innovation and increasing technologies. But this has just been a dissection of who we're dealing with here, because like I said at the beginning, this is the man. This is the $150 billion man. Yeah. And his beliefs, interests, and concerns are going to shape the decisions he makes at his company. And I think we now got to the end of this, and we see a little clearer, some of the things he has, how he thinks about things.
I think that's a good way to tie it in to that original point of where do some of his beliefs come from. And yeah, maybe it's from that those thoughts of peak oil and how we're running this race. It's gonna be, we're at the end, it's just, we're right around the corner, we're about to finish off all the oil, all the wells are gonna run dry. He's like, we gotta beat it. And it's like, it's the most foolish, the most dangerous experiment we've run in human history. I don't know, that again, that statement to me just sounds like,
exaggerated.
Like really, like the most foolish experiment, the most dangerous experiment in human history. I can, like, it's just, to me, like, man, there's so many worse experiments that were done in human history. Like, have you heard of the Nazis, bro? Like, have you heard of the fucked up experiments that they did on people? Like, I don't know. I think that is like the stuff that they did. And to try to say us burning oil is worse than, like, I don't know, maybe he's not thinking on these terms, like, yeah. But it just blows my mind. How can you make a statement like that? That's so foolish. How can you make us, like, that's so, again, I go back to this guy, arrogant, ignorant, this guy disattached. I think he just, maybe this is just another example of how disattached he is from the average individual. If you think that somebody turning on their car and freaking going to work, and that's one of the most dangerous experiments humanity has run. Granted, he's saying everybody doing it for the past, I don't know how many years. If you think that's more dangerous and dumb and foolish than the disgusting things that happened that humans are capable of during, like, World War II, whatever, I don't know. It's just kind of silly. It's just that statement itself is just silly. Maybe shows like a disconnect, whatever.
And that disconnect is going to lose him followers. Mm-hmm. And I want to go back and quote Joe Rogan here. He says, "Isn't it weird when environmental things become political? When the denial of environmental things is predominantly from some faction on the right, and the opposite is from some faction on the left. It becomes a political thing." So they dig their heels in the sand. No, it's fine. This is the way the earth is. There is a natural cycle. It becomes a mantra that they repeat. And I have this little bit of a tangent that I put together here on this whole side of things, because, and I'm aware, there are people in this conversation that are not coming into it with open minds, or pretending to come into it with open minds, but honestly are honestly considering the points. They're not honestly considering the points the other side is making. They act like they are, but they're not. Okay, and I know those people exist, and there are also people that have a belief, one way or the other, on whatever side, and they don't really know how to justify it, so they get mean, they get ugly, when they're challenged on it. And this exists. This is the political landscape, and the ideological landscape that we exist as humans on. So that existed. But for people who honestly are looking for the pursuit of truth and trying to understand things, and when we talk about trying to give people some ideas of, like, how to think about the world and how to use first principles in their thinking to come to an answer, because I'm going to go into this a little bit, because as much as I'm an environmental engineer, the amount that we dealt with atmospheric chemistry, and in particular climate change, in university is small. It's not a full course. It's part of a course. There's other things we focus on, and in my day-to-day work, this is not a topic that I'm familiar with. So I'm coming into this trying to piece things together from the scientific literature. Okay, so let me talk a bit more about this. So, I think it comes down to, like, what the hell do we really all want here, right? I think what people want varies, but most people across the board, they just want a future they can live their lives out with their friends and family, and that's it. People don't want to be squabbling about a topic, and we could touch on this. The issue is when you push against an idea, it's because you think that idea is going to affect the world negatively, and they're going to affect your world negatively. That's why you push up against an idea. So some things that don't help in in this whole realm I'm seeing, okay, is this, it's when people or groups and their ideas get marginalized, treated as insignificant or peripheral. Nobody likes to have their ideas or beliefs shot down. Okay, that's pretty easy. Nobody likes to have them poked holes in, especially if those ideas are near and dear to you. Okay, that's tough. Okay, so you gotta go into this carefully. I often also think that that is the reason people dig their heels into the sand. Like I said earlier, it's you're feeling the fight or like you gotta put your hands up. You're being attacked. That's problem. And then they're also in this whole realm of thing inside of the right wing. There's a lot of conspiracy theories, which alter people's perception of reality, and nobody likes to be the victim of gaslighting. Okay, someone is out there, and they're given information that makes them question their own sanity or perception of reality. That sucks, man. Nobody wants to be in that mindset. And it's really tough though, because here's something that I find is tough. So you gain a perception of your reality as you grow up. Okay. And some of these concepts, as it comes to like global warming and climate change, they're not obvious. They're not intuitive. Okay. Like imagine, here's an example. You're a kid. Okay. And, you haven't gone, maybe you're just going into grade school or whatever like that. You have in your backyard, a greenhouse, and it's wintertime, and you're kind of like in the greenhouse, and you're like, why is it warmer in the greenhouse right now in my backyard versus outside? And so through schooling, through curriculum, through knowledge from other people's and wisdoms, you might learn something correct. You might learn about the UV spectrum of light, how wave lights from the sun, short waves come through, heat transfers off, some of them get captured in there, and you get a conceptual idea. It's hard, but like if you weren't taught that, trying to explain that reality of why is it, it's snow outside, but it's warm inside on a sunny day inside this greenhouse, it's hard. So if someone else came along to you and said, no, it's not to do with the sun, it's to do with we have a hot melting core under the ground, and the heat's coming up, and by putting a nice little structure over it, you're stopping the heat from blowing away in the wind, and the heat's coming from the ground. And this could be picked apart, obviously, but you could believe it. And you could also use a lot of scientific terms to explain it. Mm-hmm. And like specific heat and insulation, but you come to a very different endpoint in terms of your understanding of the world, depending on where you gain your information and how you use the information you then have to re-verify that it is correct and works again and again for different situations. So how would you, just throwing an example, okay, let's say I believed it was coming out from underneath the ground and it was the wind blowing across. So then what could you do? Okay, you put it up on stilts. Your whole greenhouse goes up on stilts. You then you put a wall around the base of those stilts, and you start looking at the temperature. Okay, oh look, I'm actually not getting warm temperatures underneath my greenhouse anymore, but I'm getting warmer temperatures. So that's a silly experiment, but just the idea of how you can you have to gauge how things work. But the very nature of our understanding, fundamentally, from some of these things, varies a lot, and I think people get incentivized to pursue alternative theories about them when they feel like they're being marginalized for other ideas and beliefs they have. So that's kind of my less than succinct political commentary on climate change, and that actually lands me to where my current stance on carbon tax is. This is, as I'm learning about these different ideas, carbon tax, effect of CO2, political climate. Here's what here's where I've currently landed. Okay, I'm fine with a carbon tax as long as it's either revenue neutral or doesn't impact low-income people at all, and only minimally impacts middle-income people, and justifiably impacts high-income people. And as long as it's the carbon tax, implementing it, as long as it measurably makes a difference to the market, that is that it is actually doing something, and it's not just this weird thing that we gain revenues off of, but it's not actually, it's measurably making an increase to decrease carbon, and I would say arguably accelerate sustainable energy technology. So it's doing both. It's accelerating sustainable energy technologies and reducing carbon. And if it just so happens that reducing carbon prevents an environmental catastrophe, great. Anyways, that's my final kind of that's where I'm at when I think about carbon tax right now.
Okay, so let me ask you a question about that then. Mm-hmm. When it comes to carbon tax, are you pro having it in addition to emissions limits regulations?
Interesting. Okay, so emission limits.
And the reason I asked that, so just to give some context, is because when it comes to reduction, so again, what is our goal? The goal is to reduce the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, and we have different methodologies to do that. Carbon tax is one of them. We also briefly talked about, or mentioned, I should say, cap and trade, and also emissions-based limits. So these are all different methods. And one thing about carbon tax that William Nordhaus, who again is the granddaddy of carbon tax, that he discusses, is that it should be done as an alternative or as substitute to emissions-based limits, emissions-based regulations. Why is this important? Because you don't want to doubly tax or doubly smack, for lack of a better term, can't think of the proper terminology, the companies that are emitting. Because, say for example, if you have tailpipe emissions out of a car, you'll have emissions limits that you have to meet in terms of NOx, in terms of carbon monoxide, in terms of particulates, so on and so forth. So you as a company have to spend money in terms of reducing the emissions out of the tailpipe. Now you're also paying for the carbon tax in addition to that. So that, or we could use the same example for some sort of power plant, some coal fire generation power plant, so on and so forth. So again, are we doing a carbon tax, or are we doing emissions-based regulations, or are we doing both? Because what William Nordhaus was the proponent, and again, who's often quoted, he says that we should pick one. We shouldn't do both simultaneously, because that's unfair and it goes against the primary goal of kind of being tax or revenue neutral in that sense. So what's your take on that, Elliot?
My gut is to lean towards what William Nordhaus is proposing, and I know that's opposite to what they did in Canada. We are dealing with a carbon tax system, well, a federal one. How it works in Canada is if you don't have a provincial or territorial carbon tax currently set up, you have to adopt the federal version, and then the federal version has both a carbon tax and this kind of emissions limit, cap and trade type shenanigans going on too.
Not only that, but even other regulations that are already in place separate from carbon tax, not even attached to it directly.
Yeah. Well, I think it's, would this be fair to say that those cap and trades being built into them make the tax less effective, basically, in its function overall and what it's trying to do? So to me, it's a convenient way to kind of move pollution around from our biggest emitters. I don't know.
Well, like cap and trade is? Or?
Yeah, cap and trade is.
Yeah, it's kind of like a shifty way of moving stuff around where you might not ultimately see benefit in a specific location, because it's kind of like more a movement of money than a movement of carbon necessarily.
Yeah, and let me break that down. So the idea would be, let's say you're allowed to emit 1,000 tons of CO2 from your plant, but you only emitted 800. So the difference between 800 and 1,000, that becomes this kind of potential that you can sell to somebody else or move to another location. And that's what we're talking about. So you create an artificial threshold, and then the difference between what you actually do and that threshold becomes like
it's a credit. Right?
Thank you. Yeah.
So exactly, and that's actually one of the criticisms for cap and trade, is that ultimately you're not really seeing a reduction in pollution necessarily, but more so just flipping around the money. So it's just a game. So again, it goes away from the primary goal, which is to reduce carbon, and goes towards a secondary goal of just creating a market or creating this money flipping machine, essentially.
Yeah.
So in terms of other things for the carbon tax, I do just really want to highlight that element, that and my belief on it too is that it should be done in a way that is revenue neutral. It should be done in a way that minimizes the tax burden on the consumer, because when we have taxation of our carbon, it's just another taxation that's being added to the consumer. We can say companies pay all we want, but eventually it's going to be passed down to the consumer, as Elon so eloquently put it. So to that effect, this needs to be essentially compensated by not having money given after the fact, but rather via a rebate, but rather reducing the tax paid by the individual from the jump, because that way we're reducing the amount of public bureaucracy and administration that's required, right? Because if we simply reduce the income tax, right, in order to adjust for the increased revenue in the carbon tax, then we're not necessarily adding these extra layers of administrative bureaus and all this stuff that have to track all this information.
Which costs money.
Which costs a hell of a lot of money. It's not an easy thing to do, to put these systems together. So it makes more sense to have a system that's a bit more streamlined in that sense. And again, are we going to do emissions regulations, or are we going to do carbon tax? My belief is that we have been successful with emissions-based regulations. It's actually not a belief, it's a fact, because when you look at cars, current day in 2020, combustion-based vehicles, they're much cleaner than the combustion-based vehicles that were being produced 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And you can illustrate this by the fact of, you just have to go to somewhere like Nepal, India, or wherever that's a third world country where they're still running really crappy combustion vehicles, and you can smell the difference. I've been there. People were wearing masks over there way before Corona hit, and that was due to the air quality, because they're breathing in all these shitty engine exhausts. Well, that's not that big of a deal here in North America and Canada, US, and that's by virtue of these emissions-based limits, for the tailpipe limits, right? So we have to kind of acknowledge that these have also been working. These have brought some benefit, and companies have spent a tremendous amount of money, technology, research in order to get their products to a certain quality, to a certain standard. So by introducing the carbon tax, again, we can think that it's a good thing, but we're kind of, again, taking away from the revenue neutrality of the endeavor, and essentially charging those companies making business that much more difficult. You might say, okay, who cares? They're making so much money anyways. It's just not that simple. Companies have margins they have to meet. They have certain baselines. They have certain standards they have to meet, and all these little things is going to like cause them to make certain decisions. Like, oh, just tax the small percentage. What are they going to notice? Well, that's going to cut to the bottom line, and that's going to make their fundamental decisions for where they do production, where they do manufacturing, how much they pay people. It's like all these things are priced in. These are factored in. So yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm curious. So all said and done, where have you landed? Like what on carbon tax? Like what is your ideal scenario?
My ideal scenario is let's get the carbon tax, but then we really need to figure out what's up with these emissions-based regulations, because it simply doesn't make sense to have both of them together. To me, they're not mutually exclusive, but to me, it's almost like they should be theoretically, if you want things to work correctly. Because if not, then it's a system that's geared towards gaining money from industry. A system that's geared towards gaining money from industry stunts industry, then you're actually stunting the progress and growth you're going to need to actually solve these issues. So long term, it's a bad idea. Short term, it might seem like a good idea, but long term, it's a bad idea, because you're stunting innovation, you're stunting growth, and eventually it's going to be that innovation and growth that gets you out of this issue. So short term, good. Long term, bad. So ultimately, carbon tax, yes. Emissions regulations, no. We need to rework that, and but that's not how things are being done, unfortunately.
Got it. Yeah. Well, I think we've been going quite a bit here.
Yeah, this is a pretty hefty podcast.
Yeah, let's maybe wrap it up then, I think.
Okay, yeah. So this was the episode on the carbon tax. Hope you guys enjoyed that. If you did, please go follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcast. Give us a thumbs up. Give us a review, a comment. We really appreciate it. And check out our website, firstprinciplespodcast.com, for more information, more podcasts. You can contact us on subjects, suggestions. And yeah, we'll catch you guys next time.
Peace.
Peace out. Break down from ground up, baby.
From the ground up, baby.
Peace.